Hello everyone, welcome to Lokmanya. My name is Mark Kinra and today I am going to discuss about human rights issues of Uyghurs outside of China. And for highlighting this important aspect, our guest is Mr. Salih Hudayar. Mr. Salih Hudayar is PM of East Turkestan government in exile and has been advocating independence of East Turkestan. He is also the founder of East Turkestan National Awakening Movement. Mr. Hudayar, welcome sir.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. Hudayar, my first question to you. China has been trying to designate certain Uyghur militant organizations such as East Turkestan Islamic Party as terrorist organization. Could you please provide us with historical timelines of this organization?
So the East Turkestan Islamic Party actually was created in the late 1990s, 1997. During this time, we had a secular national independence movement that has been thriving, that had been gaining momentum in East Turkestan, and especially in Central Asia, especially given that the Central Asian republics, recently gained their independence from the Soviet Union. And seeing this, China began to worry that the international community might support, East Turkestan independence. So they began to, release some more radical elements from the religious section, Islamists from prison. One of them was Hassan Makhzoom. They released him from prison and let him, in 1996, and let him go off into Afghanistan into 1997. And then there, this gentleman set up what he called the East Turkestan Islamic Party, and divided essentially the overall East Turkestan independence struggle, national independence movement that we had, and split it from, a secular to a more Islamist narrative. And this obviously fit China's agenda, because what they were trying to do was to prevent the East Turkestan issue from becoming, a national issue, to where it would be more easier, the international community will support it, to a Islamic issue, an issue of fundamentalism, jihad, etc. That way it could easily point Uyghurs as a bunch of jihadists, threatening not only China, but the international community. Following 9/11, this group and its leaders, they were in Afghanistan, they were forced into Pakistan. Many of them, were killed. And in 2003, their leader died, and then the group went underground. Hassan Makhzoom was killed in what was reported at the time as a Pakistani special forces operation, and he was killed in that. Then in 2008, this group re-emerged, or a group re-emerged through a YouTube video, claiming that it is the Turkestan Islamic Party, and that it is, going to strive for an Islamic state in all of Central Asia. And warning people not to attend the 2008 Olympics and so forth. Then just through a series of YouTube videos, there was a bunch of propaganda, but it wasn't really until 2014 that this group began to find itself and people began to take more close attention to it. Because you had several thousands of Uyghurs that magically, mysteriously appeared. I don't want to say magically, but mysteriously appeared in Syria, where they were fighting against, the Assad regime, but also against Kurds, and alongside other, radical groups, jihadist groups like Al-Nusra and Tahrir al-Sham and so forth. China, however, has been trying to portray the East Turkestan struggle, as a terrorist movement since really, especially post 9/11. 2 weeks before 9/11, the Chinese Communist Party secretary at the time, Wang Luqian, he, held a press conference and trying to seek investment into East Turkestan. And when reporters asked, is there any violence? Is there any, tensions and so forth going on between Uyghurs and Chinese? And he said, no, there's never been any violent attacks. So-called Xinjiang has always been peaceful. I'm quoting his words, stating that East Turkestan has always been peaceful. Then 9/11 happened. Immediately the next day, China claimed that it was a victim of so-called East Turkestani terrorism for decades. 2 months later, on November 11, 2001, at the UN Security Council, the Chinese government, they provided the UN Security Council with the list of over 24 Uyghur and other, East Turkestani organizations, claiming that, these were all terrorist organizations. About a majority of them we've never heard of, like our community and even researchers have never heard of in their entire lives. One of those was the so-called East Turkestan Islamic movement. And China claimed that the East Turkestan Islamic movement was, responsible for a majority of these so-called terrorist attacks, and they were responsible for the violence, and they were the biggest threat. And they pressured the United States and the UN to recognize this organization or this, group or this claim that the ETIM exists, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, as a terrorist organization. Despite the fact that prior to that date, there had been no mention of this. There is the East Turkestan Islamic Party, but there's no mention of an Islamic movement in any records, whether it's Chinese records or non-Chinese records. Nonetheless, there was no group. To date, there has not been a single group calling itself, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement or part of the East Turkestan Islamic Movement. And for decades, since 9/11, for the past 2 decades, China has been using the pretext of, combating, fighting against the ETIM as a bid to engage in, the atrocities and genocide in East Turkestan. And we'll get a little bit more into how, Uyghurs ended up in Syria, and I'm sure you have more questions in the latter part of this. The U.S., however, this past October, delisted the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, as a terrorist organization because, one, there was no sufficient evidence that this group even existed. Two, they said that even if this group existed, there has been no activity of this group in, other than what China claims it to be. We have no evidence of this. So, and China has been always using this group as a pretext to engage in genocide. So, that being said, we're going to delist it.
So China has supported Afghan Mujahideen during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. There are reports that Taliban provides shelter to Uyghur militants. Do you think that other than money, China has pushed Uyghur fundamentalists into Afghanistan, Pakistan, thereby radicalizing their mindsets?
Absolutely. So you had in the Soviet-Afghan War, the Chinese actually set up training camps inside East Turkestan, near Kargılık, near Khotan, where they trained, Afghan Mujahideen, while at the same time training Uyghurs and sending them into Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets. Then in 1990s, you had, after the Soviet-Afghan War, you had many Uyghurs in East Turkestan, seeing, that the Soviets were defeated. They're like, oh, we can defeat the Chinese as well. So you had a little bit of militant activities in East Turkestan. This ultimately backfired on China. And one of these incidents was the Baran massacre, in which they, slaughtered thousands of people in a failed uprising. The Chinese security forces brutally crushed an uprising in Baran in April 5th of 1990. However, in the case of like Hassan Makhzoom, for example, he was sent into Afghanistan where he was given shelter by the Taliban. At that time, China has close relations with the Taliban. Even to this day, they were helping set up the Taliban's telecommunications, providing them with weapons, and financial support. To this day, this has continued actually, and altering, the secular national movement of East Turkestan to portray it as a part of a global jihadist movement. And this effectively harms our, national movement, and this is exactly what China wanted. And you had at that time, you had the TIP versus, the secular national movement, and instead of, really fighting against China, you had these two groups competing for power, accusing one another of being, the Islamists accused the secular movement of being, funded and supported by Western infidels, as they called it, whereas the seculars, and to this day, we suspect that this was part of the Chinese intelligence operation, especially given the fact that, China has a very close relationship with the Taliban. If those Uyghurs in Afghanistan were a threat to China, they could easily get the Taliban to get rid of them, because you're not talking about thousands of Uyghurs, you're talking about a couple hundred at maximum. They could have easily got rid of them, but no, this didn't happen. In fact, you had many Uyghurs being sent into Pakistan to where they were, provided religious and other education in madrasas run by the Jamaat-e-Islam. And this is where it gets more trickier, is the cooperation, strategic cooperation that China and, the Pakistan Islamic Party, or the Jamaat-e-Islam of Pakistan, signed back in 2000.
My third question is that only. But sir, before that, I would like to know, you said that there are organizations or there are parties, which are run one backed by the secular people and one backed by Islamists. So can you name the organization or the parties?
At that time, there was no real parties other than, everybody was just part of, the broad East Turkestan independence struggle. Okay. So you had like groups like the East Turkestan, Liberation Organization or stuff like that came up, or the East Turkestan National Committee, and so forth, that in the 90s engaged in, or the East Turkestan Revolutionary Front, which historically since the 60s had been advocating for independence. And to counter this, the Chinese, they, let people like Hassan Makhzoom and others, go out, they let them go from prison, and then just let them, cross into the border of Afghanistan and, gain support from the Taliban, which, at first, this might not be as alarming, but when you look at this, if you look at the big picture, you're like, why would China do this? Why would China knowingly allow these people to go out into Afghanistan? Even when they're in Afghanistan, why would China not use its close relationship with the Taliban to capture these people and to prevent them from, engaging in activities that might harm their interests? Because the issue here is the national movement versus an Islamist movement. You can portray, the Islamist movement as part of, a global terrorist movement or jihadist movement and crush it that way. And a lot of other countries have, problems with, jihadist movements, and would be reluctant to, support Uyghurs if they were associated with that. So taking this into consideration, China felt that, this was part of this would benefit them, while at the same time it would create a rift within the East Turkestan diaspora or the East Turkestan community, not knowing on which side to, which way to fight for, because you have, saying we need independence as a secular nation, our only threat, our enemy is China, and then you have Islamists saying no, we have to liberate the entire world from infidels, and that's essentially what China wanted, was those radical elements to go out there to taint and misguide our movement, and to portray it as, a part of a global jihadist movement, where the international community would be reluctant to support, the Uyghurs.
Right. Coming to my third question, which actually you briefly mentioned. In 2009, Pakistan's Jamaat-e-Islami party signed a MOU with Chinese Communist Party, where Jamaat-e-Islami extended its support to One China policy, and both the parties stated that they will collaborate on the issue of justice, development, security, and solidarity. How do you look at this MOU, and does it have any effect on Uyghurs?
Absolutely. This MOU, not only the MOU, after that, they Pakistan Jamaat Islam, they actually, the leader stated that China invited them to preach Islam in China.
Yes.
And what kind of Islam were they preaching? I mean, in which parts of China? That's another thing. And at that time, nobody really suspected, anything. We were like, oh, we didn't really know what was going on. It was only years later that this would all come into play. In 2010, Turkey signed a strategic agreement, 10-point strategic agreement with China in terms of intelligence cooperation, military cooperation, cultural, economic, etc. Then in 2011, you had the Syrian conflict. By 2013, you had foreign fighters from all over the world coming into Syria. So starting in like 2014, you had Uyghurs, over 20,000 Uyghurs crossing hundreds of checkpoints through, East Turkistan, through China into Southeast Asia, where they were then given, Turkish passports, flown to Turkey, and sent into Syria to fight against, not only just the Assad regime, but also against the Kurds, and also, alongside other, jihadists and terrorist organizations. Some ended up, being sold to groups like ISIS to fight for them, and so forth. And this is just a justification that China needed to, portray the Uyghurs as terrorists, because for the longest time it was trying to portray Uyghurs as terrorists, but there was no sufficient evidence of that. So by sending Uyghurs into Syria, by having them fighting alongside terrorists, China pointed to that to where they were able to justify or come up with a excuse to lock up millions of people in concentration camps. The Jamaat Islam, they are a Islamic party. Muslim Islam is no way incompatible, from my understanding, is no way incompatible with atheist communism, especially when an atheist communist regime is engaging, in atrocities that are, not only threatening, Islam, but destroying mosques, burning Qurans, raping and sterilizing, women that are majority Muslim. This is something that, if the Pakistani Islamic Party was really, true to, the principles of Islam, as many of us, as it's described in the Quran and, taught by the Prophet himself, they would be the first to oppose this. Yet they are engaged in strategic cooperation with them because there is money. Majority of Muslim countries, again, it's all about money. And part of this, was to portray Uyghurs as terrorists by sending, their people, from Pakistan. They, in East Turkestan, by 2013, they started preaching jihad in Syria, in mosques in East Turkestan. I'm not talking about big mosques in the cities. I'm talking about in the villages where they preached jihad in Syria and fooled, ignorant people to think that, they'll go to heaven if they go fight in Syria. And ended up, portraying Uyghurs as a whole as, as terrorists.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hudayar. Whatever we discussed is very vital, to the background we'll be discussing again in future. So for the viewers, I would like to say that there's a second episode coming up with Mr. Hudayar. We'll be getting now more into the global space as to how various other countries come into picture with respect to Uyghur human rights. So stay tuned. Mr. Hudayar, thank you very much, sir, for your time today. See you soon.
Thank you for having me.